Hello and welcome to University Television Presents. I'm your host, Doug Mason. Today we have joining us Justin Vaughn, or should I say Professor Vaughn, who is an Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Idaho History and Politics in the School of Public Service here at Boise State. How are you today, Dr. Vaughn?
Good, Doug. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Thanks for joining us. So, I see you're on the Executive Council of both the Pacific Northwest Political Science Association and the American Political Science Association President and Executive Politics section. So, how does this environment affect your points of view within your teachings at Boise State and the lectures you give regarding politics?
Sure. So both those are professional organizations that scholars join, and they're extremely useful for us to keep tabs on what's happening in the research world, what's happening in pedagogical techniques that our colleagues around the country are using. They're not political organizations or ideological, so they don't affect necessarily how I think about politics or particular politicians, but they are useful for kind of keeping current on the new findings in the research world and the new trends that are happening in the classroom.
In terms of the new findings within research, do you ever bring any of that new information to the lectures that you talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, my classes probably split pretty evenly between discussing, general descriptive information about things we know about, whether it's about legislatures or about the presidency. But then we'll also talk a lot about, and here's what political science know, and here's what scientists know, and here's what political scientists have recently learned, and just, what the cutting edge kind of information is related to particular topics within those areas.
Definitely, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so since we're on the topic of politics, I feel like I need to address the elephant in the room. Given your political discussions and lectures, what do you think about our political system as of today here in America?
Well, the political system in the United States is very polarized. There's a real problem with a kind of growing lack of civility. There are too many people in the United States that think that the people who feel differently on an issue or vote for the other party are not only different, but they're their enemies, that they need to be destroyed or disempowered or whatever, and so it's troubling. It's easy to think sometimes that it's never been so bad, and it's been bad like this before. Certainly in the years leading up to and during the Civil War, it was worse. In some of the years, the early part of the American Republic, it was pretty bad, but it's also really bad right now.
It is.
Democrats and Republicans are very far apart from each other. They tend to kind of dehumanize and attack one another, and there's very few examples of real, leadership among our political elites in terms of trying to find common ground and trying to engage in kind of reasoned and civic discourse. And so, hopefully, we'll be turning a corner on that, and things will get better and get better soon. But in terms of the national political environment, I think that becomes polarized and anxious and hostile are the ways I would describe it.
So to follow up with that, the hostility that you mentioned, I'm curious, and I know a bunch of viewers at home are going to be curious, how are some of the ways that you believe we could implement in our political system to depolarize the thoughts and beliefs of opposing parties?
Sure. I don't know that there's any kind of rule we could create or requirement we could make, but I think by just changing some things informally, it can make a huge difference. So, for example, in the United States Congress, it's only been in the last few decades that members of Congress would come home every weekend, and that's the norm now, right? They fly home on a Thursday afternoon. They're in their district, whether it's in Idaho or Ohio or Georgia or wherever, all weekend long. They tend to fly back to Washington, D.C. Monday night or even Tuesday morning. So they're in Washington, D.C. for 2 to 3 days a week. They're crazy busy during those days because they got to cram a week's worth of work into 2.5 days. And so they don't get to know their colleagues, especially they don't get to know the colleagues that are in the other party. A generation ago, it wasn't like that, but that members of Congress would be there all the time. They would actually move their families there and live there, which is rare today. They would play basketball together on the weekends. They would have dinner clubs. They would become friends, and so it allowed Republicans and Democrats who might have felt very differently about a lot of policy issues to at least understand that the other person was coming from somewhere, normal and reasonable, and that because they have personal relationships, they could find common ground easier. And so even just coming up with ways of encouraging or incentivizing our members of Congress to stay in Washington, D.C. more and getting to know their colleagues would probably go a long way in terms of helping them work together better, right? One of the things here, a guy who's an editor for the Idaho Statesman named Bill Manny is going to be starting this project where he kind of refers to it as kind of a get out of your bubble project, and where he wants to go to events and meetings and interact with people who he would never interact with otherwise, right? And his hope is that by going and visiting with groups that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be in his social circle or in his daily calendar, that he'll understand those people better, they'll understand him better, and that relationships will form. And if not just an editor for a newspaper, but if everybody did stuff like that, again, it would be much less, much more difficult for us to kind of dehumanize the person that we don't agree with.
I could not agree more. I mean, that is something that's a big issue in politics today, and I didn't even know about the legislation that you just brought up about how now politicians and Congress members get to go home, whereas years before they had to stay in D.C. and they had to find common ground between one another, because when you look at someone as a friend or even just a colleague, and you can see that there's a human inside or a person, feelings and everything, revolving around that, it takes it much farther than just politics.
Right.
As you said, but that's really interesting. I hope we can get back to that someday. Okay, so you just had a public discussion and a panel on October 11th titled Protest and Patriotism. So do you mind telling me a little bit how that went?
Sure. It took place at the Idaho Black History Museum, which is just right near campus. And the director of the museum sent me an email, and I know him a little bit, and he a great guy, and he said, hey, I'm interested in having a panel discussion about patriotism and protest, right? And kind of in the light of this Colin Kaepernick situation. And he asked me if I'd be willing to come and talk about it. Yeah, of course. I'm not an expert on civil rights policy or race politics or anything. I study American politics and particularly focus on national politics and presidential politics and campaign politics. But I'm an informed citizen and a scholar of politics, and also appreciate the role that he's trying to play in community. So I happily went and played a part. And on the panel with me was a woman who's a professor at the University of Idaho Law School, and also a woman who is a teacher at a charter school here in town, whose students had previously done an exhibit for the Black History Museum.
Oh, okay.
And so it was a really interesting group, very different perspectives, very different backgrounds and areas of expertise. But we had a great discussion. The place was packed. There probably was 75. It's a small building, and probably 75 people in there that come out to hear, and so really great conversation about this kind of idea that where is the line between protesting and maybe going too far into being unpatriotic, right? For some people, there is no line, right? That patriotism may be for them a false construct, and that your job is to advocate for what is right and just. For others, patriotism becomes above all else, and if you're being perceived as not suitably deferential to law enforcement or the military or political leaders or American history or God or whatever, then they don't want to have anything to do with you. But I think for most people, they're not at either of those extremes. They're somewhere in the middle, and but that middle shifts, right? And so, and kind of Colin Kaepernick's protest that he started, that's continuing even now that he's out of the NFL. That's a great kind of way to frame that conversation about, is this okay? And for some people it is, for some people it isn't. Why isn't it okay? What is it that he's doing wrong? Is it that he's, and some people are upset that he and the other players were bringing politics into sports, right? It's entertainment, and they didn't want that, right? Other people said, well, I don't care about that, but he's not respecting the troops, right? Other people said he is simultaneously advocating for his cause while doing everything he can to respect the troops, right? There's an interesting story that was released, not that long ago, about how originally Colin Kaepernick, the first time he protested, he sat on the bench, and a veteran eventually got in touch with them and said, I think that's offensive, and it was a military guy who said, you should kneel. And the reason you should kneel is because that's a historic symbol of respect and penitence, right?
Sure.
You are submitting, you are asking for something. You're not demanding, you're not disrespecting. You are in a position of respect and of deference. And so Colin Kaepernick said, that's a great idea. I'll do that. I'll do it that way because I don't want to disrespect the military. And yet, despite that backstory, it becomes, he's taking a knee. He's, he doesn't care about American values and so on and so on. And of course, he's done and said, and even warned some things that help kind of burnish this narrative that he doesn't care about these kind of traditional American values. And so it's a really, I don't know that there's a right answer, but there's so much happening in there between popular culture and race politics and our veneration of first responders and the government's relationship with the NFL and all these other fascinating things that it's a really interesting example to try to unpack and to use as we have conversations about some of these bigger picture ideas.
Definitely. I'm curious why he wouldn't, when this whole scandal was going down, why he wouldn't have come out and said, by the way, it actually was a veteran who informed me that this is the most appropriate way to have maybe a political agenda, as well as trying not to disrespect any veterans or any government official. I'm just curious to which, that's how it started to snowball, and then people get involved, and then you're right, it starts to, other NFL players start to tag along, and now NBA players.
Yeah.
But it is a little interesting. Did you have anything to add?
No. That's a great question, and I don't know. There's, how the media works, right?
I do. He may have
done that, and it just didn't get covered, right? And it didn't get covered until it became particularly ironic, right? Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he kept it private for whatever reason. But yeah, that's a great question.
Just curious about it. Okay, anyway, since we're on the same line. So the protests changing in the past. Do you have anything to add on the protests in the 70s with protest of war and government and conformity, the idea of conformity? Have things even changed that much?
Well, if you compare Colin Kaepernick's protest, which was peaceful and relatively respectful, to the protesting of the 60s and 70s, it was far less civil then, right? People were burning their draft cards. They were, in the streets. There was a huge uprising, right? And people were going to great lengths to evade the law, right? Whether it was going to Canada or getting medical deferments or whatever. And so everything that Colin Kaepernick did was within the law, right? Was within his right and privilege, and so in a way, even though it has gotten continues to receive extraordinary amounts of critical attention, it was far more respectful of legal statute and norms than what we saw then, right? Now that doesn't mean that all protest is that way today, right? We've seen for the last few years Black Lives Matter, which has used very confrontational styles of protesting to get their point across. We've seen Antifa using violence in its protests, right? We've seen on the other side white supremacists behaving very intimidating way, right? Carrying weapons with them, and so while acts of violence have gotten a lot of attention, but have been relatively few in number, there is this kind of ever-present looming threat of violence at any of these events that take place. That's very true.
So as you mentioned earlier, we have to find that line that is drawn between what is offensive and what is utilizing our First Amendment rights. So I'm curious, in that discussion on October 11th, was there any clarification into what the line is? Or did you hear anything that it stuck with you and said, well, maybe there is this line when it starts to become offensive, or...
Yeah. Well, my take on it, and it was probably different than the other two panelists with me, was that protest is typically an inherently strategic act. That means you're doing it in order to achieve something, right? You're not protesting for the heck of it, right? You're protesting because that's your way to communicate dissatisfaction with a situation and hope that dissatisfaction is addressed. And so strategically, anything you do to alienate the people who can redress your grievance is a bad idea, right? That, you wouldn't be protesting if you had the power to solve the situation yourself. You need someone else, whether it's a politician or a judge or public opinion or whatever. You need someone else to give you what you need or give you what you want. And so your job is to, woo them or seduce them or to get them on your side, right? And so if you are purposefully or accidentally doing things that not only don't bring them to your side, but move them farther away from your side, then you're just a bad protester, right? And so, in that sense, if there's a chance that you are going to be tagged as unpatriotic and as disrespectful to the military in a venue which is particularly concerned with patriotism in the military, right, like the NFL,
it is,
then maybe it isn't a wise course of action, right? Because there will be more efficient and more effective ways of achieving your goals, right? And so for me, I don't really care about, is this the morally right thing to do? Is this the righteous thing to do? Is this the just thing to do? In this kind of an arena, what I care about is this action going to get you farther from your goal or closer to your goal? And if it's going to get you closer to your goal, then it's smart, right?
That's an intelligent way to think, yeah.
But I also have the luxury of not really being directly affected by the things that he's protesting, right? And so I have that luxury to say, look, the right thing to do is the smart thing to do, and not necessarily the right thing to do is to advocate vigorously for this injustice that's being perpetrated upon you and people like you.
Right, that's very true. That's a great answer. So we talked a little bit about media in our country. And I'm a little curious to what your view on it is in terms of echo chambers and having media be such an intricate part of everyday life, especially for all generations, really. Does this have any effect on our political community? Being able to...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so we're just this weird time right now where not only, there's kind of a couple of intersecting factors. One, we have at our fingertips more information than ever before in human history.
Right.
At the same time, just because of the way that social media networks function, we are unlikely to hear different perspectives than maybe at any other time in human history, right?
So true.
And so we become particularly immune to kind of being in these vacuums, right? And only hearing from people who we already agree with, right? And then, whether you're talking about Facebook or Twitter or whatever, that if you don't like what someone's saying, you can unfollow them, you can unfriend them, and we do. Right? We tend to minimize and not interact with people we don't agree with. And so we've got an extraordinary amount of information out there, but we've kind of set up these structures and had these structures set up for us where we're only hearing what we already agree with, which is particularly problematic because psychologists know the way our brains work anyway. If I believe something and you were to give me a piece of information that was different, it wouldn't change what I think. It would just make me not trust you. And in some ways, the more you try to convince me, the more retrenched I become. And so the combination of the fact that we have these cognitive biases where we ignore what we don't already agree with and we embrace what we do agree with, combined with the fact that today we are only getting information that we already agree with, it becomes almost impossible to kind of consistently and systematically engage with information that is different than what we want to hear, right? And then when you add in kind of the more recent rhetoric that President Trump uses and other politicians use, where this idea of fake news is anything I don't agree with, that it makes it even easier if someone is confronted with something they don't know, right? So, oh, that's fake news, right? Why is it fake news? Because I don't agree with it. And so it's from the liberal media or it's from some right-wing hack or whatever. And so, so yeah, we have this real information problem, right? That there's so much information. We only access the things we already agree with, reject things we don't disagree with. And citizens today are increasingly unskilled when it comes to navigating what's real and what isn't real, and having what I think some people call civic literacy, right? That the ability to find information you need, to process information that you receive, to be able to separate what's real versus what's false, what argument is solid, what argument is weak, and then apply that in your decision making and your actions.
That's so true.
And so yeah, it's a really problematic moment. I don't know what the future holds, but hopefully, these mega companies that kind of control our information access, the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, they've certainly been made aware of kind of their role in this problem, and hopefully they'll come up with workable solutions that'll undo some of that damage.
It's so true. These workable solutions that you mentioned, since of course it's such a big issue and there's not one answer to it, I'm curious. I did a paper on this last semester where we follow the media use in our country versus other countries. And Britain and the UK, they use the BBC and PBS, and in terms of the information that we use, we follow the majority of CNN and Fox, which, as we just mentioned, is mainly based off of those echo chambers that we listen to and watch shows that reaffirm our beliefs. Is there any way that you see in the foreseeable future for not only my generation, but the younger generations that are so involved with their own devices to seek information that isn't so biased?
Yeah, I mean, if I did know, if I had a good answer to your question, I'd probably make a lot of money.
You would, yeah.
But unfortunately, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm hopeful, right, that something emerges, but it'll be a challenge. And one of the things that political scientists know is that when you make people, which kind of builds on some of the stuff we talked about a moment ago, if you make people watch things they don't agree with, so if you do an experiment, you sit down a conservative Republican and you put a TV on and MSNBC's on, Rachel Maddow's on, right?
Sure.
That they will not only not like it, they'll get really upset. And
Really?
and not only, and then you do kind of these follow-up surveys, and not only are they upset, but their trust in the political system in general has declined because they had to confront this information they didn't want to hear. And so, there are these really visceral, kind of psychological and emotional things happening that encourage us to avoid that information that we don't want to hear and don't want to agree with. And in this day and age where it's so easy to tune out anything you don't want to hear, and I imagine it's only going to get easier, I don't know exactly how you can make people select information that challenges their assumptions, challenges their core values, and do it day after day after day.
Consistently.
Yeah,
right? Consistently looking for information that maybe gets in the way of their own belief.
Right.
But as you said, I'm hopeful as well, and maybe there will be a turning point coming up here in the future. But anyway, it looks like that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yes, and next time, tune in. Thank you from all of us here at University Television Presents. I'm Doug Mason. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.